Alright, so let's have a look at Blender, and we're going to have a look at some basic navigation skills today. So what we'll need to do first is just set up a few things in Blender, and I like to go File, User Preferences, and then on Editing, which should be the default, we want to turn these global undo steps up as high as we can go to 256, and then just save the user settings. It'll just allow us to undo a lot more steps. 32 just usually isn't enough. From what I've seen with students working in the classroom, sometimes need a few more to undo some mistakes. So there we are. Now the interface for Blender is quite convoluted, and until they release 2.8 it's not likely to get better. So what we've got down the left hand side here are our tools, but we're not going to worry about those because we're going to focus more on the shortcut keys. On the right hand side we've got all our properties. This is the default layout for Blender, by the way. You can easily mess this up. Down the bottom we've got the timeline for animation, and then we've got this toolbar here which we will use. This toolbar is context sensitive. So before we do anything else, what we want to learn is some of the shortcut keys. So the first shortcut key we want to learn is A. A will deselect everything in the scene. If we push A again, it will select everything in the scene. So A is like a toggle between selecting and deselecting. To actually select something individually, you right click on it. So if you right click on the square or the cube, it'll light up with an orange mark around it. If you right click on the light up here, it'll select it. If you right click on the camera, it'll select that. So right clicking selects, A will deselect. The next thing you want to know is how to switch between modes. So down here we have got object mode, and that's the default mode that we're in. But if we hit tab, we'll switch into edit mode. It actually just switches between the last two modes that you used. So if you happen to use one of these other modes, you can't figure out why I can't get into object mode, then that's why. So tab will switch between object and edit mode. Now notice in edit mode, some different things show up. We're just going to hit A to deselect everything, and this only selects everything in the object that we're editing. So see, it doesn't select everything in the scene now. We're in edit mode, we're editing that object. Now what this object has is some vertices, they're those little points there. It has some edges, they're the lines between the points, and it has some faces, that's the flat surfaces that connect the different points and edges. To switch between these different selection modes, currently we're in vector selection mode. So if I right click one of these points, I can select one. To switch between them, down the bottom here, there is the little toolbar which has changed. Notice it's different in object mode than edit mode. Now I can select edges, and then the last one is faces, which lets me select faces. So I'll deselect everything. Now one of the navigation tools that I've already used is the zoom, which is the mouse wheel. I can zoom in and out. But another handy tool is rotate. So that is the middle mouse button. If you hold that down, you'll be able to rotate around this. So if you move to the right, it will rotate around anti-clockwise, etc. Okay, up, down, and so on. Down in the bottom left corner, you want to be making sure that when you're working with something, you've got the Z pointing up, Z-axis pointing up. Otherwise, you're working upside down. And it's not a big deal. I mean, if you happen to build the whole model upside down, it's very simple to just rotate it up the right way. But some of the controls will be confusing and reversed. So that is rotation. So we can select. We can switch to different selection modes. So select edges. Now what if we want to select more than one edge at a time? You hold Shift. I can select 3 edges. If I change it to vertices, notice the vertices are already selected that were connected to those edges, but I can hold Shift to select more. And if I switch to face mode, I can hold Shift and select multiple faces. You can also shift right click to deselect faces if you select too many. Now let's say I've got quite a complex model and I want to select all of the faces except maybe the top one. Now I could go and do this, but if my model had a lot of faces on it because I'd cut it up or subdivided it in some way, and I just wanted to leave the top, the top part undone, then what I can do is use B, which will let me draw a box. Top stays undone. There is a problem with this though. Or C to paint. So I'll just deselect that. So C, and then any face that I click on, I can't rotate in this mode, so I'd have to rotate and then C again, will let me select those. But notice that it didn't select the ones on the other side, even when I did the box. So let's do this, B. That should be able to select the ones on the other side, but it doesn't. Because by default, it's only selecting the ones that I can see. So to fix that, this button down here, you can put it in wireframe by just hitting Z. That way it'll select all the ones that I highlight. And what I'm looking for is those little dots. If I go back out of wireframe, see the top is not selected. But another tool that you can use is this one here. So this limits the selection to visible. So when you select something, it only selects the visible things. You can tick it, you can untick it, and you'll see now that I've got some little dots showing through here. It's not quite wireframe, but when I make a selection, it does select the things through there. So if you don't like working in wireframe because it's a little bit confusing, you can turn this off, and that will let you do some selection. Another handy navigation tool is switching the views quickly using the number pad. You will need numlock on for this, and then on the number pad you've got 7, which will take you to the top view, 1, which takes you to the front, and 3, which takes you to the right. Now the numbers along the top of the keyboard don't do this. They are for something different. It's the number pad on the right hand side. If you're working with a laptop, you'll have to look up how to emulate the different viewports in Blender. These are quite handy. Now, one of the things that you will see here, you can see that it looks like it's got, because I've got this on here, it looks like there's a smaller cube inside. It's actually not. It's just the other side of it, because we're in what's called perspective mode currently. So we've got perspective on that, and sometimes you may want to turn this off. I'm just going to go back to this view here. Sometimes you may want to turn the perspective off. To turn the perspective off, you just hit 5 on the keyboard. This puts it into an orthogonal projection or parallel projection, and what it means is there's no perspective, so it is quite difficult to determine depth, and you wouldn't want to render an image in this unless you were going specifically for an isometric view. But 5 will toggle between no perspective and no perspective. Then when you put it in the side views, these are more like what you'd be familiar with in DVC. If you've done any technical drawing, you would have these views here. You can also get the bottom view by holding Control and pushing 7. So holding Control and pushing the number will give you the opposite view. So 1 gives me the front view, but Control 1 will give me the back view. 3 gives me the right side, Control 3 will give me the left side. So there's some basic navigation tools. One last thing is locking something to an axis. And this is quite useful. Say for example, I use the grab tool. So G is the grab tool. I want to grab this and I want to pull it out this way. I could just click on the handle and pull it that way to extend it. But I could also push G, and this actually lets me do all kinds of weird things with it, but I want to lock it to this axis. Now, I know that the axis is the green one, and down in that bottom left corner down here, the green one is Y. So I can just push Y, and it puts this line there, and now it locks it to that axis. If I want to then move this one, G, I can lock it to that x-axis and move it out that way. With Blender, you don't need to, oh no, sorry, never mind. G, Z, I can move it up and down. And it's the same with rotation. Let's say I select the whole thing and I want to rotate. Rotate is R. Well, currently the rotation is kind of weird. It's done via the viewport, so it rotates it as though I'd stuck a skewer through the screen and I'm spinning the shape around. But if I lock it to the Z-axis, it's going to spin around that up-down axis. If I lock it to the X, it's going to spin around that X-axis, and the Y around that Y-axis. Pretty sure you can do two at the same time, maybe. Yeah, you can. It doesn't seem to really work though, because that's, well, if I lock it to the Y and the Z axis, it's just spinning around the X axis. So it's the same thing there. And lastly, scale. So S is for scale, and it will make something bigger or smaller, but you may only want to scale it along a particular axis. Scale it along the X axis. Oops. Scale it along the Z axis, make it thinner, taller, or along the Y-axis. Now, one thing to be aware of is this: when that happens, your model has gone inside out. But that's the simple term for it. It will not render properly in a proper renderer. It will not render properly in Blender if it's set up properly, because the surfaces that reflect the light or reflect that the camera can see are now inverted, and it can't actually detect that they are there. So if you were to model a whole building in something and then export it to something like Unity, you wouldn't see anything. It would be invisible unless you happen to be able to get inside it and see these faces in here, or the faces inside it. So if you get this thing where it kind of looks funny and sometimes it goes really dark shades or appears to disappear, it means your model is inverted. There is a way to fix it. You can push the spacebar and you can type make normals consistent, and it should fix it. Okay, so there's some basic navigation. Put it back in perspective mode. You see the difference between perspective mode. You're more familiar looking at stuff in perspective mode. That's why it kind of looks funny when you see this view here. It looks like a Lego instruction manual. Perspective mode is what we're kind of used to seeing visually.